Well, my route into food studies was long and indirect because when I started working, nobody I knew outside France, and some people in China did food studies. So I started working on the history of agriculture in China, and I was the author of the volume on agriculture in Joseph Needham's series, Science and Civilization in China. So I was working on the history of producing food, but the consuming of food came into it much less. And we didn't really think in terms of food studies then, we thought in terms of agriculture and farming. Even though I had wonderful colleagues like Françoise Saban, who will also be at the workshop, who was working on the food aspects of old Chinese texts like Chenjia Xu, which I was working on the farming aspects of, I thought, well, that's lovely. Let Françoise, who is so gifted and perceptive, do the food, and I will just stick with the mud and the fields. So I went on working on agriculture and technology, and then gender and technology and other aspects of technology for many years. And I went to work in California. And while I was in California in the 90s, I was on the editorial board of California University Press. And I knew pretty well the editor of East Asian Studies there, Sheila Levine. And Sheila Levine said to me, I've got this really exciting new project. It's mine, it's personal, I love it. I'm going to launch a California University Press series on food. And nobody else in the English-speaking world had done that. And I said, oh, that sounds wonderful. I wonder if there'll be enough people interested to read it, I said. And she also launched the journal Gastronomica. And I thought, well, you know, food. I work on food. And it's so interesting in California, the food culture and the paradoxes and people's worries about food and the things they don't think about, like the global inequalities when they go to the supermarket or the canteen. So I started teaching a course on food, and I think it was certainly the first in my university. But I wasn't specifically teaching about food in China. I was motivated mostly by what I saw my students thinking about and not thinking about. And I approached it from the subject of anthropology and, you know, the big questions that anthropology brings in about production and consumption and body and mind and all these different things. And I think the students really enjoyed the class. I really enjoyed the class. And then I started thinking about my Chinese work and my previous work on agriculture in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia. And I thought I should start thinking more in terms of food as well as crops. And one big turning point there was reading Emiko Onoki-Tene's Rice's Self, which was obviously such a stunning book and I think influenced so many of us. And not only that, but it helped really launch the whole movement of food studies, which is now so big everywhere in the academic world, but also in the newspapers and online. And so now food is everywhere.
I would like to ask more about the beginning, like the agriculture. When you started off doing that research, what was the difficulty? Like in terms of access, did you have access to, for example, historical records, archive, ancient texts, or field work? What was it like doing research on agriculture in China back in the days?
I had a very particular entry because I started working with Joseph Needham as soon as I got my
Mm-hmm.
BA. So I didn't do a PhD, and I didn't do all that training, and I didn't spend the year in Shanghai or the year in Taipei that all my colleagues did, which is something I've always regretted in retrospect. In those days, it was pretty much impossible to get into archives in China. And in any case, I didn't get the training. But what I did do was work with the magnificent library that Joseph and other sinologists had accumulated in Cambridge, and which had all the Nongshu, the agriculture treatises, you know, the texts which the elite would have been using or were producing. So it was a particular view on the making of crops and society in China. I recognize that. It was grassroots only insofar as the elite decided to pay attention to grassroots knowledge. But at the same time, it rang true. It was the practicalities of it, the materialities of it rang true. And one of the reasons, I think, is because farming was a respectable, honorable activity. Not meaning that, you know, I mean, in theory, peasants were as good as anybody. Well, but you didn't disgrace yourself if your family, your official family fell on hard times and you ran the farm. And so, you know, a fair number of the people who wrote these nongshu, well, almost everybody who wrote these nongshu, except the imperial compilations, had actually been on a farm and run the farm, and, you know, they knew what they were talking about. And when I had been working, I started off working on Chenjia Xu, which is based on millet cultivation, and it's northern Chinese. And then I thought, well, you know, because Joseph said to me, well, if you want to learn about Chinese agriculture, I suggest that you sit down and translate Chenjia Xu, and after that you'll know all about it.
That was the assignment for you.
So when I got through all the bits of Chenjia Xu that Françoise hadn't translated, the first Jan, I thought, well, I better go on to Wang Zhen now. And oh my God, it's all about rice, and I don't know anything about rice. So I persuaded Joseph that I should go to Malaysia for a year and do field work there. Basically, I just went into the fields with farmers and watched them and photographed them, and then tried to do what they were doing, and they would watch me and photograph me. And but it was, I mean, I can't say that at the end of it I would have known how to run a rice farm, but I really felt I had a much better grasp of what people were talking about in those books. And I could also, I mean, the great moment for me was that it actually showed me how the past serves the present and the present serves the past. You know, they were introducing green revolution technology. The farmers were having to grapple with all that change and accommodate and, you know, do all the things that you need to do to survive when the government tells you it knows best. But there were also these unavoidable material realities that neither government nor farmer could magic away. So the fieldwork experience was really, really helpful to me, because of course before that I was just, you know, I didn't have long fingernails, but I was definitely just a desk academic. And I think I came back to those texts with a completely different perspective then.
So is that also the time when you started to combine anthropology together with sort of more historical approaches?
Yes.
So,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, did you, well, more anecdotal question. Did you find those Nongshu applicable in the paddy field in Malaysia?
Here, guys, forget what the Agricultural Development Authority is saying to you. I've got this book from the 13th century and it's Chinese and we all hate the Chinese, so let's use that. And they were very anti-Chinese in Kelantan because they were very sincere Muslims. And so, although the popular dish for everybody was Hainan chicken rice, but yes, I saw how, it was as if the text suddenly started to gain a new dimension for me, because I could now understand the material processes and the technical procedures and sequences that they were describing. And it wouldn't really have been transferable because the kind of ideal rice culture in most of the Chinese books is Jiangnan. And it depends on irrigation, accretions of irrigation schemes. And what they had in Malaysia was a much more tropical climate, very different seasons, very different rice varieties with different needs. And also what they had was a river that flooded once a year, and a monsoon rain that flooded everything once a year. So in a way, what the Green Revolution was trying to do was make it more like Jiangnan, to introduce irrigation schemes and more intensive cropping. And it didn't really work very well for a number of reasons. Complicated embedding of agriculture into other activities, which made it very hard for people to make the transition to a double cropping system and survive economically. And then one of the interesting things was that even at the time, the irrigation challenges were very great. The modern engineering, there is no perfect solution. You have to keep working things out as you go along. The infrastructure is very expensive. It's very difficult to make changes, but it doesn't always work according to the first plan. And it's interesting that now, 40 years later, they still have these same problems that they were facing when they first began introducing the irrigation scheme, that they can't control the water. So it's, it's more like being in, actually in Hebei than like being in Jiangnan.
What I find quite interesting in your background is that you didn't go into, well, the food and China didn't come together. They met in the end. So it was a kind of your trajectory, which is kind of quite counterintuition, in the sense that people nowadays would think, oh yeah, you work on food, you work on China, and then that's quite a natural thing.
Well, I think one of the reasons might be that, when I started working, Françoise was working in France, so very different intellectual community there and a very different set of approaches to analyzing history and society and what makes people and what makes society, the Annales school. And I was influenced by the Annales school myself in my work, but I guess the sort of big questions that that I and my colleagues were looking at in thinking about history of agriculture was Marxist-oriented questions. So, all of my Chinese colleagues, they too were working on production and modes of production. And it wasn't until much later that people got the second bit of Marx, which is without production, no consumption, without consumption, no production. So it took us a while to get there.
That sort of brings us to the question regarding the how do you see firsthand in person throughout your research career the development in food studies?
Well, I think when it really, when it got going, there was a journal called Food and Foodways,
Yeah.
which I think was very much very close to a lot of French colleagues, and they were very involved in it. Françoise, I think, was very involved in it. But it was in English because already the hegemony of the English language was so great that you needed an English title for your journal in order for anybody to look at it. So Food and Foodways took many approaches to food, but I think it would be fair to say that most of them were social and cultural in and sort of more consumption oriented, because one thing it was doing was plugging a gap where everybody out there was working on modes of production and the development of underdevelopment and things like that. And suddenly it seemed that, you know, looking at whether people were hungry or well fed and what they did with what they had was a very valuable complement to that, but also took you into very different areas of understanding human life. So I think in the beginning there was a kind of segregation between the two endeavors. And you know, the people who worked on whether or not development was good for peasants in India did of course say, well, do they get anything to eat at the end of it? But they weren't particularly interested in what they were eating at the end of it. And then gradually, I think with greater awareness of global chains, global trajectories, and the turn to consumption studies, I think that the barriers between the two approaches dissolved, so that now people who are really prominent in food studies are very happy to combine, well, they see that it is essential to combine the making and the eating, the getting and the enjoying, or the hunger and the political structures.
I wonder, how do you see the challenges back then when you started doing food-related research, and the challenge now in the field?
Well, it wasn't so much food-related research I started with as food-related teaching. And that allowed me to be very open and to try to bring in many, many different approaches. So, you know, from dietetics and biology through to Baudrillard and desire and what have you. And, you know, I could see that different students in the class would have affinities to different approaches. And I would ask everybody to write a term paper, and the term papers would be completely different. Just drawing on a different literature, asking different kinds of questions. And they were almost always fascinating. So I think what I deduced from that is that it's, you know, it's an all-encompassing, all-interesting theme that everybody can relate to and that everybody is happy to theorize about or devise methods for. But what you have to do is frame it and harness it to your own particular intellectual agenda. Well, I think one of the things is that you know, food really opens up all these Foucauldian questions about governmentality, about the making of, you know, the techniques of the self and techniques of the other, about ways in which identities, individual, communal, are produced. And I mean, there's so much wonderful work there. Where would one begin to talk about it? But if you think, for example, about the way in which Judith Farquhar has looked at food and medicine, not just as, oh, in China, you know, medicine is food and food is medicine, but how you play between these different roles of food to instantiate, embody ideas about a good life and practices for a good life, the despairs about not achieving a good life. And so in looking at that through the idea of a good life, you open up really new ways to think for historians who are very hidebound and modernist in their assumptions about what matters. It really opens up new ways to think about the past as well as the present. So it's it can be very creative. And then I think together with that, one of the things which something like food studies or material culture studies has done for Chinese studies is that it has brought, you know, it has created a much denser dialogue with fields outside the China field. China becomes interesting to people who would never ever have, you know, China, what do we know about China? It's so complicated. But they eat pickles, and Polish people eat pickles too. You know, it gives people, I'm joking, of course, but you know, it gives people a stake. It builds bridges in a way that previously, you know, the old style political histories or social histories, you had to know so much about China before you could even begin to understand what anybody was talking about. And somehow something like food opens it up. So it means that people working on China start to think seriously about ideas, methods, angles that other people are developing, and whether they could use them for China, even though they are not indigenous to China, not emic categories. And similarly, I think it has made it much easier for people who are not China specialists to engage with what is being done on China.